"You're just a maid," he sneered, then found out she owned his entire empire. The first thing people noticed about Alessandro Vieri was not his wealth. It was the silence that followed him. When Alessandro entered a room, conversations ended without anyone asking them to. Men twice his age lowered their voices. Business partners who had spent years building their own reputation suddenly measured every word before speaking. Everyone in the city knew his name. They knew he controlled restaurants, shipping companies, luxury hotels, and private investments that stretched across borders. They knew his empire was built through discipline, fear, and absolute loyalty, but nobody knew the man behind the name. Nobody knew that every morning, before making decisions that affected thousands of lives, Alessandro stood alone in his father's old study and looked at a photograph of the only person who had ever believed he could become something better. His mother. She had always told him one thing: power means nothing if you lose the ability to see people. Alessandro remembered those words. But he had spent years convincing himself they were impossible to follow. The world had taught him a different lesson. Trust made people weak, kindness created enemies, and emotions were something powerful men could not afford. That was why, at 38 years old, Alessandro Vieri was respected by everyone and loved by almost no one. His mansion sat on the highest hill outside the city. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely empty. The employees moved carefully around him. They never asked questions. They never looked directly into his eyes for too long, except for one woman. Her name was Elena Moretti, and she was only supposed to be a maid. At least that was what everyone believed. Elena had worked inside Alessandro's mansion for 3 months. She cleaned rooms, prepared meals, organized documents, and quietly disappeared whenever important guests arrived. Most people ignored her. Some treated her like she was invisible. The security guards joked about her old clothes. The younger employees laughed, because she carried herself differently from the others. She never complained. She never fought back. And that made people misunderstand her even more. They thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. Elena had learned long ago that not every battle needed noise. She was 29 years old, but life had already forced her to become older than her years. After losing her father, she had spent years trying to protect what remained of her family. She had worked countless jobs, faced humiliation, and learned how easily people judged someone based on appearance. She knew what it felt like to be ignored. She knew what it felt like when powerful people looked at her and saw nothing. That was why she never judged anyone else, not even Alessandro Vieri. One evening, Alessandro returned home after a difficult business meeting. A mistake had been made in one of his companies. Millions had disappeared through a hidden financial scheme. His executives blamed each other. Everyone defended themselves. Nobody accepted responsibility. Alessandro walked through the mansion without saying a word. Everyone immediately moved out of his way. Everyone except Elena. She was standing near the library, holding a stack of old documents. Alessandro stopped. "Why are you here?" His voice was cold. Elena looked up. "Mr. Vieri, I was asked to organize the old files." "That doesn't answer my question." She lowered her eyes slightly. "I was making sure they were not damaged." Alessandro looked at the papers in her hands. "You touch things you don't understand?" The words were sharp. Elena stayed calm. "I understand more than you think." For a moment, the room became silent. Nobody spoke to Alessandro like that. His expression changed slightly. "Excuse me?" Elena looked at the documents. Sometimes people who are ignored notice things others miss. Alessandro stepped closer. "You are a maid." The sentence came out with complete certainty. "You clean rooms. You serve food. You don't analyze my business." Elena looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only disappointment. "You're right." She placed the documents down. "I am only the person who cleans the rooms." Then she walked away. Alessandro watched her leave. He expected her to look hurt. He expected an argument, but she gave him nothing. And somehow that bothered him more. The next morning, Alessandro discovered something strange. The financial report that his executives had prepared contained a small error. A very small one. But that small mistake would have cost him another $10 million. The person who found it? Elena. His assistant, Marco, placed the report on his desk. She noticed the numbers didn't match. Alessandro looked at him. "She?" "Elena." For several seconds, Alessandro said nothing. Then he picked up the report. The mistake was obvious once someone pointed it out, but none of his trained professionals had seen it. Only the woman everyone ignored. A week passed. Alessandro began noticing things. Elena always arrived early. She always helped the older employees. She never took credit. When someone blamed her for a mistake she didn't make, she simply corrected the problem without exposing the person responsible. It confused him. In his world, people protected themselves first. Elena protected others. One night, Alessandro found her sitting alone in the kitchen after everyone had left. She was repairing an old book with damaged pages. "What are you doing?" She looked up. "Fixing something that still has value." He looked at the book. Most people would throw it away. Elena smiled faintly. Most people throw away things when they stop seeing their worth. The words stayed with him. Because for the first time in years, Alessandro wondered if he had done the same thing. Had he thrown away parts of himself because they became inconvenient? Slowly, without realizing it, Alessandro started trusting her. Not completely, not immediately, but enough. He began asking for her opinion. At first only about small things, then bigger things. And Elena never tried to impress him. She never acted afraid. She simply told him the truth. That was something nobody else did. But while Alessandro was changing, someone inside his empire was watching. Victor Rinaldi, a man who had worked beside Alessandro's father. Victor believed the empire belonged to him. He had spent years waiting for Alessandro to fail, and now he saw a weakness. A maid, someone Alessandro trusted. Victor began spreading rumors. He told people Elena was manipulating Alessandro. He told them she was using her position. And slowly, doubt entered the mansion. One evening, Alessandro confronted Elena. "Who are you?" The question surprised her. She looked at him quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean nobody accidentally understands my companies. Nobody accidentally sees things my executives miss." The room became silent. Elena looked away, because she knew the moment had come. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to be treated differently." Alessandro's expression hardened. "That is not an answer." She took a deep breath. "My father was Matteo Moretti." Alessandro froze. The name meant something. Everyone in the business world knew Matteo Moretti, a legendary businessman who had built one of the largest private investment groups in the country, a man who disappeared years ago after a mysterious illness. Alessandro stared at her. "Your father?" Elena nodded. "Before he died, he created a trust." She opened a folder. Inside were legal documents. "The companies you control today," she paused, "they were never owned by you." Alessandro looked at the papers. His face changed. "Impossible." "No." Her voice remained calm. "They were protected under my father's trust. When he died, ownership transferred." The silence was heavy. "You are telling me?" Elena looked directly at him. "I own the empire." For the first time in years, Alessandro Vieri had no response. The man who controlled everyone suddenly had no control over his own reality. But Elena continued, "I never wanted your position. I never wanted your money. Then why work here?" Her answer was simple. "Because my father trusted you." Alessandro looked confused. "He trusted me? He believed you were not like the men who wanted power only for themselves." Those words hurt more than any accusation, because Alessandro knew he had become exactly the kind of man Matteo feared. The revelation changed everything. But before Alessandro could understand it, Victor made his move. Documents were leaked, accounts were frozen, business partners turned against the empire. Everyone expected Alessandro to fight with anger. Instead, he did something different. He listened. He investigated. And for the first time, he allowed Elena to stand beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. Together, they uncovered Victor's betrayal. The final confrontation happened inside the old company headquarters. Victor smiled when Alessandro entered. "You really think a woman who worked as a maid can save this empire?" Alessandro looked at him. "No." Victor smiled. "Then you admit she is useless?" Alessandro's expression remained cold. "No." He placed the evidence on the table. "I admit I was blind." Nobody spoke. Alessandro looked at Elena. "The person I underestimated was the only person who saw the truth." Victor lost everything that day, not because Alessandro destroyed him, but because the truth finally reached everyone. Months later, the empire changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly. The employees noticed something different about Alessandro. He still carried authority. He was still serious. He was still the man everyone respected. But now, people no longer feared him. They trusted him. One evening, Elena stood in the mansion garden. Alessandro approached her. "You know, everyone still calls you the former maid." She smiled. "I don't mind." "Why?" "Because being underestimated taught me patience." Alessandro looked at her. "And what did being powerful teach me?" She waited. He answered quietly, "That I was the poorest man in the room when I had everything." For the first time, Elena saw something rare. Not the businessman, not the mafia boss, just Alessandro. A man who had finally learned that strength was not measured by how many people feared him. It was measured by how many people could stand beside him. Years later, People would still tell stories about Alessandro Vieri. They would talk about his empire, his influence, his power. But the people who truly knew him remembered something else. They remembered the day a man who thought a maid was beneath him discovered that the woman cleaning his mansion was the person who owned everything he had built. And they remembered that she never used her power to destroy him. She used it to show him who he could become.